Hey there everyone, I hope you've got pretty far along. As we were talking about making prices reasonable for the quality you provide, but also starting with them in the lower end of the reasonable price range. We've reached the point of where we're doing the financial statements, but in this case they're considered projections because you haven't actually produced any revenue as a company. Even if you as a contractor have already been doing this as an independent contractor, you still haven't done it as a company. And everything, especially the financials, are your sales point to get a business loan. Some businesses require a loan and some businesses don't. Some can be started on very minimal cost and some have to take on quite a bit of cost to meet the legal requirements. And that said, so you want to be reasonable in your projections. Unless you're like I was in a situation where I had more clients than I could handle, which is why I opened a company and started hiring people, then usually your first year is going to be pretty low. So you need to be reasonable. What would actually be a reasonable low amount of sales in my good season, and what would be a reasonable high level, which we actually would rather stick with a medium or low level, in your slow season. But do not make it look prettier than it is. You're more likely to get slapped in the back and not approved for a loan if you make it look better than it really would be. Because you gotta remember, these are bankers, they're financial experts, and they know what's reasonable and what's not. So I've given you right here the general formula, which it should be a growth of a certain percentage divided by 12 times the first month's sales. And that would equal your second month's sales. Use your second month's and do a percentage of growth divided by 12 times second month equals third month sales. You want to do it by the month in your first year and then make your first year's projections also in an annual report. You want to also include your expenses because it's not a financial report if it just says revenue and no cost. And that's also when the red flag will go up in front of the banker when they're like, I know all businesses have costs to produce. Whether it's traveling to the client, your gas, or it's having the building because maybe you're in an accounting service and you do it in an office. Or if you're like me and you meet people in public places like Starbucks, well, you got the cost of coffee. Because I hope you don't go to a restaurant and not consume some kind of food they provide. But anything from the cost of marketing that you will take on, or other methods of gaining clientele, the cost of the building, the cost of any equipment, medications, treatments, whatever, based on what industry you're in. If you're in education, the cost of the books, the school supplies, the table that you'll sit on to do it, unless you want to be like my company and travel to the clients. And then you wouldn't have that kind of overhead. You wouldn't have to get a building. You wouldn't have to necessarily have books, even though some still do, because if you go to the home, usually kids have that the parents want you to help them go over and not necessarily create a totally different curriculum. And that said, so you need to consider every single possible cost there is that's a necessity in the first year. And then what isn't in the first year, put in the second year, and then others in the third year. So your expenses will go up, but you should add the additional expenses that are not necessity for the first year. Add them in the second year or the third year. And you should slowly add the additional cost as your revenue grows. But you should also always keep your costs low. And in order to profit, your rates have to be, the price of your product or service has to be reasonable for the quality. And it also, you have to have a reasonable quantity that you're selling per month in the first month, and then using that to go on to calculate your first year. The second year needs to be done by a month-by-month basis as well, in addition to a quarterly, meaning every 3-month period, and annual report. Your third year only has to be annual And some like it to be quarterly, but you must have annual, at least for your third year. In all of the seasons that you have low sales, and you'd project based on your competition's history of when they really started to hurt. When did their sales go down? And for what period of time? You want them to be at the biggest sales point to be projected at 50% of what it would be in the good month. This can sound ugly, but it's the reality. Like I had my first year of my tutoring company, in the summer, I only made $1,000 a month. But especially those of you who are parents, you know kids are very hard to get to study unless they have to because they failed a grade and are going to summer school. So that said, that's a very horrible month, considering how the other months when school was in, which was 9 months out of the year, I was making about $15,000 a month. Well, but that's also why, since your income's not guaranteed, and especially in the first few years, you don't know if you'd have it that bad like I did, where my first bad season was $1,000 a month after I got used to making $15,000 a month. Well, in that sense, you want to make your bad season's sales be very, very low compared to your good season. Because especially in the first few years, you're not going to have as big of an image unless you're already a very influential professional known in the community. You're going to have a very, very bad season in your first few slow seasons. You're going to have bad sales, really low projections. It's the best because that's the most reasonable. And then again, if you make your bad season look like it's going to be pretty, the financial professionals, like the loan officer, will know it. They are experts, so they're the one people you cannot trick in this one section. However, if this is too difficult, even using the formulas I have given, I want you to contact me via my forum, my phone number, whatever way, going back to the last section where I gave you my contact information. And I, as an accountant with my master's in accounting and bachelor's in accounting, will help you with this part. In addition to any other part of the business consulting, because this is the hardest and the one section that almost everybody I know has needed me to step in on. But take the challenge, try it yourself, and if you think it's not so great, or you doubt yourself, contact us, but at least try it and see what you can do. Here are some additional formulas to use, calculating each month. January year 1 is times the percent of growth plus 1. If you don't add the plus 1, then that would be considered your company producing less. And that would equal January. February of year 1 times percent of growth plus 1 is February of year 2. Why? Because we're talking about the percentage of growth being from year 1, the same time of the year, to year 2, the same time of the year. We don't want to base good season on bad season grow. You want good season to grow by a certain percentage compared to other good season of the same time of year. And still, you want the slow months to be 50% at the maximum productive as the good months. And there can be growth from one year to the other in your bad season. I would advise not showing any growth in the bad season just to play safe and to not make it look like you're trying to make the financials better than they really would be. Because then again, that'll make it even harder because it'll build your reputation as always trying to falsify stuff to trick people into giving you money because you'll make them this many, and the honest truth is you may not even be able to pay them back. And they need to be able to look at honest reports and actually know that, so they know what they're getting themselves into. But once you do this, the best thing to do is to get what they call a small business administration loan, which is where the Small Business Administration backs up a loan that private banks give you, called an SBA loan. So the banks are willing to take a bigger risk, and a startup company is the biggest risk they can take compared to if they loan to a company that's been around for a few years. So you want to play it as safe as possible, but also keep the loan at the smallest it can be. And if you can, work some other job, or if the breadwinner in your house has some extra money to put into it, don't take a loan at all. But this is also part of the reason I said in the last section to keep your expenses at the bare minimum. They have to be in the first few years. As you produce more revenue, you'll be able to take on the expenses that are needed but not bare necessity and still produce profit. But some of them, like the marketing expense, you don't want to cut too shy and not put enough into, or that's going to mean you don't have a check tomorrow. Marketing is very vital. It's the biggest thing, because if you can't get the word out there about your company and the quality of service or product you provide, you're not going to have customers, thus no sales. So it's very vital that certain expenses like marketing, you don't cut short and you don't keep too low of a budget, or you'll be basically asking for failure, or at least not growth. So this is another part where usually people have in to help with making the marketing plan, using methods that are most cost effective, and doing a cost analysis of their financials of what expenses you're taking on compared to the reasonable prices of your product or service, and so forth. Usually I have to step in here, but I challenge you to try it on your own. Try to do this. If you don't know how to do this, or you doubt yourself, contact us for further assistance. As you saw in the last section, I gave you ways to contact me, which I'm here again. These are ways to contact me or contact the other clients that use us and have given each other advice. Y'all can talk to each other and do whatever on the forum. You can look at different advices I've given other customers that I post on my YouTube and watch them. You could even message me on Facebook to set up an appointment to be in person or via video, whatever. But this is the hardest section, the accounting. Most people are intimidated by it. Most people hate it. A lot of people don't even want to try, and then they just call me right away. But either way, I urge you to try, and if you can't, or you're stuck, it's too complicated, contact me and let me help you do this. But either way, it's vital that it's done right and well. So I was talking to you about expenses, keeping them bare minimum. Well, you have what's called fixed expenses, which are ones that are a certain amount regardless of how much business is done or how it is run. Like if you consider companies like Sylva and I keep mentioning, the rent of the building won't go down just because their sales went down. It's a fixed cost. But there's others, like wages, that can go up and down because if you don't have clients for the tutors to be tutoring, you have no reason for them to be there on the clock. So they're variable expenses. And when it comes to people that are on salary, meaning not hourly paid, and especially if they're not contractor, you will have salaries, or in other words, somebody who's guaranteed a certain amount per year regardless of how many hours, or equipment, or the loan payment, and a lot of other expenses that vary by the industry are fixed costs because you have to pay that certain amount regardless of however much of whatever much. Like how many hours the employee works, if he's salary, he still gets paid that certain amount. So you want to keep your fixed expenses low, because if you struggle or you don't produce at all, it's really going to hurt you. You can't do anything about it. You got to pay that $1,200 no matter what, even if you only produce $200, which would be a very horrible case, but it is a reality for some startups. But other things like your marketing, you don't want to cut short, but they are variable costs, because as you have less, you can invest less, but also it's one cost. If you invest too little, you're asking for your future to be the same or lower sales. It takes time to get a regular clientele. Like I go to Starbucks almost every day, so I'm a regular clientele for that location, or maybe even Starbucks as a whole as I float around to different locations. But they know almost every day they'll sell me a coffee. Well, but that wasn't in the first few years. That was after they got big enough and got a reputation as being the best coffee shop to get the best coffee, that they started getting people like me that come regularly. So you need to treat everybody like they are a regular, everyday customer. And that includes as far as how you treat them. That includes as far as how you do the marketing. That includes how well you pay your staff. because you want high quality people. But ideally, you want to do all the work you can yourself, even if that's working you an 80 or 90-hour week, in the first while until you have secured a net income. If you take employees on day one, especially if they're salaries and not hourly wages, you're maximizing costs as much as you can. Yeah, it reduces your stress, and you'll be doing less work, other people will be doing it. But the financials are usually the ugliest in the first 1 to 2 years. So you want to keep them very minimal. Like if you have to rent a building, rent as small of one as you can to do everything that is a necessity, but not necessarily to have that big, huge, beautiful break room. And you want to keep your salaries and wages low by doing all the work that you can until the sales reach a certain point that you can make a nice profit with other people helping. Electricity, try to keep all the lights turned off, everything unplugged, whatever you can, as much as you can. Keep the water bill low. If that has to mean that people can't use your bathroom, so be it, unless you're a restaurant where it's legally required that you give public access. But you want to keep all of these at the bare minimum and eliminate any that you can. Even if you will later on take on that expense. It's better to do it later when your sales are higher so you can still profit. But if you take on all these that are not bare necessity in the beginning, then you'll be more likely than not one of the many to report a net loss in your first 1 to 2 years. If you listen to me, you could be like me and making over $100,000 in your first year, or at least making a profit, which is a very rare thing. But I'm telling you some of the keys of how I was able to do it. I have more expenses now, but there's still not very many. I have less than $200 a month in expenses. A big part is I do the work myself. Second part is that I already have such a big clientele, I don't have to put much into marketing. And I'm trying to give you guidance on how you can do the same thing. Produce growth via marketing, but keep your expenses low so you can produce profit even in the first year. And all of this should actually be applied to your first should actually be applied to your first 3 years. All this about keeping your expenses low, reducing them as much as you can, only taking on bare necessity expenses. In your first 3 years, you're going to do the make it or break it of it all. A company I had mentioned, they reported a net loss in its first 3 years. Well, if you report 3 out of 5 years, especially if it's your first 3 in a net loss, that's actually defined as a hobby, which means that when it comes to legality, the IRS will see it different, and so it will tax you different, which actually usually becomes more taxes, higher rates of taxes. And being self-employed, you're going to pay your own Social Security, that being both the employer and employee end of your taxes. Between your Social Security, your Medicare, all of those expenses that you see that your employer of the past has taken out of your check, you got to pay double it because you pay your employee end in addition to the employer end that you may not even know exists. And the same is true with the benefits, like health insurance. And that's assuming you open a type of company in the form that you can get benefits yourself. But you're still going to be paying both ends for your employees, which is another reason that taking on one expense is like taking on 2 expenses when you hire people. To keep your costs low when you do have to hire employees is one thing. You can consider hiring only contractors, so you don't have to provide them with benefits, neither do you have to pay their expenses that they take on in order to do the job. Rather, the contractor can deduct it like they are a company where they take their income minus the cost they took on to do the job for you, and they get taxed at a lower income rate. So that can be quite useful because then they can usually pay less taxes making the same income. So that's quite attractive to a lot of people. But for those who are parents or otherwise need benefits, they have to be employees to get it. By law, you're not required to provide benefits unless you have 30 or more employees. That doesn't mean contractors. That means actual employees. So to keep it low, then again, hiring contractors would be better because they wouldn't be employees, so you wouldn't have to necessarily, after having 30, to provide benefits, which means you can eliminate that cost. And that's something you at least want to do in your first 3 years. Keep those low. Some costs that aren't vital is like a building. If you're like me in a tutoring or you're an accountant, you can go meet somebody at their office, or you can go to their house or wherever to meet them. If you sell products, you can be similar to Amazon, where it's only ordered online and you ship it to them. You don't necessarily have to have a building, especially if it's selling products like at a retail store. Brick and mortar is going out of style. Places like Amazon have dominated the market now to where everything's convenient. They click a button and then the next day they got what they needed. They never had to get out of that chair to get what they needed. You know, the world's becoming more and more lazy. We expect everything to be convenient right there, right then, and not to have to work so hard or go out of our way as we used to be willing to go out of the way. And that said, consider factors that may even, like in the case of having a brick and mortar building, since so many of those are shutting down, it actually would be better anyways as far as serving the market with convenience if you did only online. So some cases like that, that's actually not just how to make more profit, meaning less expenses, but also to get more sales based on the ever-evolving market. And because a lot of people like convenience, that's the majority of America at least, then traveling to people and meeting in public locations or other places that's convenient to them is often better than having a building. And because a lot of entrepreneurs are now working out of their home, and as much as parents are wanting more work from home legitimate jobs, there's a lot more like myself that are hiring people to work from home so they don't have to rent an office. Just because they have employees or additional people working for them, they don't necessarily have to have a building, especially with the evolvement of so many parents want to work from home but have a legitimate job. And there's getting to be more and more legitimate work from home jobs. As you feed into that market, you'll also have an easier time hiring people. Because until it becomes a norm to where a big percentage of jobs are work from home and legitimate, then working for you will be more attractive. But it's also less attractive when you hire contractors for the main reason that you cannot provide benefits. Things to consider and to avoid. Most businesses fail due to taking on costs that are ideal but not vital to a startup. Some things you can do out of your house in the beginning and take on the expense for it to be done elsewhere later on. Some people fail because they take on too much expense for marketing or too little, or they use the wrong methods, thus not producing sales or interest, not feeding the market as far as getting the people that actually need and want what you provide. A lot of people even get startup loans that are not even necessary because the expenses they take on are not bare necessity. So they get in debt for more than they really had to. And that debt, in addition to the payments they have to make and the expenses they took on that were not really necessary, these are the reasons they usually report a net loss in their first few years. So only get an office or a brick and mortar building of any sort if you actually have to have it. That goes for any kind of expense, but those are just most commonly the types that people think they need and they a lot of the time really don't need to. Like if you had a restaurant, most likely you would have to, unless you want to be delivery only. But then at the same time, people may want to come and pick up the food, so then again, you may actually need to. Or you can start minimal by having a food truck, where you travel to different markets, serve different people by driving all around town and holding it at fairs or other places where there's events that mobile or just one stand, food can be served. And this isn't to say after your first 3 years that you couldn't, like, let's say, make that food truck an actual building and especially if it was a nice building, if you're supposed to be expensive, high quality food for upper class people, then that's not to say you couldn't eventually take that on. But usually stuff like a food truck is faster or otherwise quickly prepared and usually not healthy, but would be great if you could make healthy food doing. And in some cases, that's not necessary. Some businesses, like the kind of food that'd be slower cooked and more healthy, often is better off as a sit-in restaurant and not as a fast food, thus it would be more necessary to have a building. But you need to consider all of this and see what really is necessary. And unless you want to be like the majority where you report a net loss in your first year, 2 years, maybe even 3 years and end up failing, you need to keep those expenses very minimal and only do what is actual bare necessity, with the ideal expenses coming later on. Between the cost of the product or the people to provide the service, if you can't do it, which ideally is you providing all the services possible with all your time, then marketing is the most expensive. But it's also the most important. So you'll need to make sure you allow enough for stuff like marketing to generate business, but you also need to keep everything else that's not as a necessity, not really a necessity, out of the picture until you have been reporting profit for a while. I know you hate hearing all this about keep certain things out there because it'd be so great to have a building or so great to do whatever. But I'm telling you exactly how I was able to report a 6-digit net income in my first 3 months. This is how I did it.